Thanks for being here with us, everyone. My name is Jeremy Greenberg. I'm a policy counsel with Future of Privacy Forum, and I'm really happy to be joined today by Carolina Alonso. Carolina, would you care to introduce yourself, where you work, and how you're involved in XR?
Yes, hello. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm an associate at BakerHostetler. It's a law firm, and several much of my work actually entails dealing with cutting edge technologies and privacy and advertising and helping clients kind of navigate, how can we get our really cool products out there while, complying with the law.
Right, yeah, and I really like that, you're here with me in Sculptor VR. It sounds like your job involves a lot of like creative thinking, and we're being creative right now. I got my like sandcastle going, you got your designs going. Like, I think this is going to be a lot of fun.
Yes.
Yeah, and let me just start off by asking, you mentioned, you work with companies thinking about, privacy issues, legal issues involving XR. We don't have today like any XR specific or VR specific regulations on the books. So tell me about like some of the laws though that we do have on the books that might apply to this space.
Sure. And you raise a really good point about not having anything specific on the books, because I just wanted to point out there are certain laws that do target specific kinds of technologies, such as California's connected device law and several automated vehicle laws. So it is interesting that while it's not unheard of to have these kinds of laws on the books, that XR hasn't really necessarily been addressed, which is why we have to kind of turn to what we do know about the law, which in the grand scheme of things is very generally applicable to any type of technology that you're working with. So for example, you have your basics, you have your California privacy, the CCPA, you have the GDPR, you have, if you're providing an online service, which I'm guessing your XR tech would be doing, you have
Mm-hmm.
the several privacy policy laws. And those are kind of your basics. And then you kind of have to think about, okay, what am I actually processing here? And then that's where, although it's not text specific, now you have specific data type of laws, such as biometrics laws or health information laws.
Yeah, wow. So yeah, it sounds like it's a complicated web, to say the least. And yeah, I'm really glad you brought up all of these different categories of laws, some sector specific. We often hear about like the patchwork of laws when talking just about like the comprehensive privacy laws in the states. So we have the law in California, CCPA. Soon we're going to have this comprehensive law in Virginia, but what you've described is really like a much more complex patchwork. So what is your take on sort of like how can companies really like make sense of all of this and comply with these laws when they're designing this kind of tech?
Yeah, so it's really complicated because it's not just the laws that we have to pay attention to. We have to look at the interpretations of those laws by the relevant regulators, uh, as well as some of these laws have private right of actions, and we see plaintiff attorneys having creative arguments with how they interpret the law, and that means that that interpretation is going to go through the courts. through judges that may or may not have a good grasp of the technology itself, and who, the companies can't necessarily brief beforehand, and get their opinion on what they might think of the technology. So I think it's really important for companies to kind of take a holistic approach here and really consider, okay, what are our internal policies that we can put in place, even though we don't know, maybe the laws, and a lot of these laws are fairly new. The CCPA is still fresh, and we have the CPRA, which will, amend the CCPA and basically be the new California privacy law. Even though we're not very clear on how that's going to be enforced or interpreted, it's very important for companies to look internally and think, okay, how do we view this? How do we view this tech? Because the people who are going to understand the technology the most are going to be your engineers. They're going to be your developers. And having conversations with them is really important to how you interpret whether a law applies to you or not.
Right. Yeah. I really like that you bring up the point, Carolina, that it's really the companies who know how this technology is working. So Carolina, you mentioned something about, how it's really important to understand the particulars of the technology. Could you go into, a little bit about why that is?
Yeah. So the thing is that there's huge differences in how data could be collected or processed or retained, not just based on the purpose of the data and the technology itself, but what technology you're actually talking about. And there's a huge difference between, object detection, where I can detect any object in this room because I know that it's taking up space in an empty space, versus facial landmarks, where, I might be trying to actually put little pinpoints around your face and not necessarily detect that an object is on the screen or in the space. And that makes a huge difference in how we should be interpreting the laws and what kind of data is being involved, and also what kind of risk mitigation points we should be considering, such as the retention of the data and notices, and how you educate consumers about what's happening. And I think it's really important for, judges, regulators, the internal developers, the people in academia, and especially the lawyers who are helping facilitate all of this, really understand those nuances.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. Yeah, you have to understand the nuances between these technologies if you're going to, regulate them, or you're going to litigate, or, think about these things even in a more sort of like with a policy perspective, and in a more kind of like academic way. Yeah, I think this is a great use case for, why folks need to really, working in the space, really need to understand the technology, and, what makes sense from a regulatory and legal perspective to, really promote user privacy in the responsible and appropriate way.
Yes, exactly. And that, to your point about policy, that leads to how are you going to write these laws, and what are you going to target as, points of, regulation, or areas that companies can improve upon if you don't understand what's happening.
Right. Yeah. Makes total sense to me. And that's something that, in my job as a policy professional, it's, I very much feel like I need to, understand the technology the best I can, have conversations
Mm-hmm.
with technical folks, because I don't have that background, but, not be too afraid of a little math here and there, and try to make sense of it.
Yes.
This sort of brings me to another point, when often when we hear discussions about, privacy risks or potential harms or questions, they're often very, future looking. We talk about, risks that maybe we don't see today, but we could maybe see in the next like 5 to 10 years. Like there's a lot of talk about using, eye gaze data, or,
Mm.
measurements of pupils for various purposes. But it sounds like, really, whether or not we can even do those things today is, a question. And, companies are not necessarily, taking those actions yet. So like, what do you think, I guess, as someone who's, in close contact with these companies developing the tech, like, what do folks tend to, get wrong in terms of like mapping the risks of this tech?
Yeah, and that's a really good point because it's really easy to simplify the circumstances and think of this as, okay, well, you're processing people's health data, for example. You have some level of insight into how they move or how many steps they take or other sorts of kinds of data collections you can take. But I can take the example of like human characteristics, like you mentioned, to take eye gaze or something related to the pupil and use that in a way that we may not know is possible in the future. And something to kind of keep in mind is, while this is cutting edge technology and we do need to understand how this works, these concepts aren't very necessarily new. And that's why it's also really important for companies to take a look at from the academic perspective of thinking about, okay, from a historical perspective, what can one do with human characteristics? And I think it's an important thing to talk about of the capabilities of it, because we've seen it before with, the eugenics movement, where you're taking face measurements, cranium measurements, and you're trying to make a determination about someone's personality. And I think that can get dangerous fairly quickly if we're not actually thinking critically about, okay, what's the data that's actually being processed? How is it actually being used? How is it being retained? And also, all these theories about identification or, being able to tell someone's ethnicity by the way they walk, a lot of this, that it's important to look at the academic side of it, because a lot of it can be junk science. And there is some fear around it because, we don't know what we don't know. But I don't think that that's necessarily addressing the practical, what's practically happening and what companies are really trying to achieve.
Great. So, that's all the time we have today. Carolina, thanks for joining us. I appreciate your thoughts and your avant-garde sandcastle, and yeah, let's do this again and create a new super innovative reality.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's been so fun to build a sandcastle with you. And I very much admire yours. I want to become tiny and go in there and actually explore the landscape. And I look forward to having more conversations with you about XR tech.
Yes, I agree. Thank you very much.